Just staring at myself. Yeah.
Hey, James.
Hey, John. How are you?
I'm all right. How about you?
Cool. Yeah, not too bad. Just had our first ever liquid social.
Oh yeah, how'd that go?
There's obviously only two of us in the company, so we went for really nice sushi. Good. I opened up PR to remove that field. I think I originally was using it, and then in one of the conflicts just lost it, and then forgot I'd included it at all.
Yeah, I kind of figured it was something like that. It seemed like it's just inert, it seemed like to me. So
Yeah. This guy's refusing to join the binary bandits, and I'm gonna exile him for it. I'm gonna bring it up as much as possible until he yields.
I don't know what it involves yet. It sounds scary.
This is like a reply coding challenge, but everyone wins a MacBook. Apparently, you get taxed on it if you win it as well, so that's good.
Is it an M2?
I don't know. It just says MacBook, so it's probably like this big, and you have to share
It's a
it.
book. It's a book that says Mac on it.
Yeah, we're waiting on Sky's acceptance to join the team. It's a bit of a privilege. I don't know why you're not accepting.
I know Mike's not going to be attending today. I don't know what our turnout will be, but we Justin Abrams put a comment or put a topic up, so I guess he's going to be here too. So we'll give it a few more minutes.
Good morning. Did we get anyone to volunteer to be scribe last meeting?
It doesn't seem like it. At least we didn't make a note of it. If we did,
If we don't have anyone, I don't mind retroactively volunteering.
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we're 3 after. I'm not sure if Justin's going to join. I assume so, like you said, because he put himself on for a topic, but I guess we can come back. So yeah, not much of a huge turnout today. I will really quickly go over some of my stuff. So survey results, kind of interesting. I'll share my screen and I'll make these available to anybody who's interested in them. I don't just want to make them completely public at the moment. Sorry. I don't want to make them completely public at the moment, because there is some like company details in here. But I could, we could consider doing that too. I'll quickly go over them. I think a lot of this is not surprising. A couple of the good things in here is we did get responses from some lesser known vendors and ones that I don't even believe have ever shown up to a community meeting before. So I think that's good. And I would say that most of the responses are in line with our kind of proposed SDK changes, like things like events, and supporting like a bulk and cache model, as well as like a pulling down a rule definition model. Yeah, so I'll go over some of the questions. First of all, is there a difference between your client SDK and server SDKs? Largely yes here. Does your feature flag implementation handle flag evaluation in single user client-based applications? Is it done dynamically or bulk and cached? We kind of have a combination here like we expected. Nothing too surprising. This one I thought was interesting. So is there an explicit way of kind of doing a reevaluation of cached flags? Largely yes. And I think this one response here is a slight misunderstanding of the question, but still interesting. The question was really about an API to trigger a reevaluation from like the actual author's perspective. This answer kind of mentions that there's a streaming connection, which sounds more like getting a change event from the backend, but that's also something we ask later. And then there's one answer that says we don't cache flags. So this is probably more of the dynamic evaluation model where a rule set's pulled locally. And you can if you want access to the survey, you can, I'll gladly invite you, but you can actually see which respondent, if they filled out their vendor name, is responsible for each question. Does API provide a means of subscribing to events? Yes, in all cases except one, which says feature is imminent. And then there is, event subscriptions. So we see a lot of on change, like change ready error, that kind of thing. So again, consistent with what we have proposed, which I think is good. This one I found really interesting. So is client-side flag evaluation performed synchronously or asynchronously? So I think this was misinterpreted because I was very surprised at this distribution, 50-50. Then when I looked into the respondents and looked into their particular APIs, at least in JavaScript on the web, everything was synchronous. I think every single example I looked at. So I think this question was slightly misinterpreted as like, is there some kind of ready event or something like that you need to wait for before you can run the flag evaluation? Yeah, because like I said, I looked into the people claiming asynchronous and the actual APIs are not, there's no awaiting the actual evaluation in the JavaScript, the web SDKs at least. The other thing is maybe people were again thinking of the server briefly. I'm not exactly sure. It might be worth following up on some of the people who answered asynchronously where we don't believe that to be the case. But you can look into the data if you'd like. Yeah, and then so this is context update. So we again, answers we're not really too surprised about. So change in identity. There's an endpoint to do this. So grabbing a flag from a different for a particular identity. So anonymous versus some kind of identity, some kind of identify method. So you can see that there's like a lot of similarity. And then this one is one that looks like it's more dynamic evaluated. So we could support this as well. But it's one of those things where kind of the lowest common denominator is probably what we need to support. So I think how the API actually looks is going to have to be dictated by more of these patterns, because you can also kind of fit this paradigm into the others. Yeah, what happens to cached flag evaluations when that evaluation context changes? So this is a specific question that you were interested in, Pete. And there's a lot of variance here. So it's probably worth looking at these individually. Everything's a little bit different. And then here, do you provide a mechanism for local disconnected? Half no, and then half yes, or something, something similar. This one's interesting, yes, but only on the server side, as we regard it as a bad security vibe. So I think this is like kind of referencing not pushing targeting rules to the client. Default flag values, again, this one's pretty highly varied. Do you like have a default initial flag value that you can set within your SDK? Bulk evaluation, again, pretty varied. Yeah, so they're defined, they're generally problematic for analytics. That's 2 questions. So this one has a longer answer, but yeah, again, you can take a look at the data. What are some pain points you've encountered when developing feature flag? So this is interesting. It's something that we've talked about a lot. It's hard for developers to know how network request strategy will behave. People have very different assumptions about what will and won't trigger a network event. I think this is to a large extent what we're trying to cope with too, how to deal with how the different paradigms do asynchronous calls and that kind of thing. Developers constantly worry about the API going down, but not about things that are way more common, such as poor network connectivity, weird DNS, bad block lists, etc. I also thought that was interesting. Do you allow developers to create multiple instances of your SDK? That one was kind of interesting. And then this is a specific question about mobile apps. Kind of nothing too surprising here. And then I thought this was an interesting answer too, about how to better support client-side usage. Yeah, and then this last question also like kind of talking about how mobile SDK, or sorry, client SDKs, mobile and web, are different than server SDKs. And in most cases, they're significantly different. One says they all behave the same. Oh, actually, this one is also saying they all behave the same. So definitely interesting, especially on a per response level. I'd recommend you look at it if you're interested. If you don't have access, just ping me, let me know. I'll put the link in the survey. And if you'd like, just ping me and I'll give you access. Next thing, I opened an issue here, which I think is worth talking about. It's something Pete and I have been talking about a little bit. But before I open an OFEP, I wanted to throw this out there. So global providers and context, and kind of like just like global state and how to maybe deal with that. So we have some interesting back and forth. Some people watching the issue haven't commented yet. I'm particularly interested in anyone who's developed an SDK, especially, or vendors, on what their thoughts are here. So yeah, Justin has a couple takes. Pete, I did respond to, I did have time eventually to wrap my head around your response, and then I responded to some of your points. And I think the very last thing that I won't take too much time on is our experimental web SDK. So I think I've published periodically an experimental version of the JS SDK that basically works on the client. What I've been taking the last day or so, taking some time doing, is actually refactoring the JavaScript SDK to publish to actually have like an alpha pre-release version of the JS SDK. I'm calling the web SDK, that's built from the same repo. So there's a common module. Basically, it's just using an NPM workspace setup. So there's 3 modules: a shared module, the existing server implementation, and the client implementation. So I'll soon hopefully open a PR that will kind of split those 3 out. So basically, we'll have the web SDK, the alpha pre-release web SDK, being built from the existing JS SDK repository. And I just, like I said, I'm going to make sure it's only publishing experimental versions that are tagged experimental. They'll have a pre-release NPM tag, so it'll say like -experimental in the version name, and the version but I just wanted to do that because it's going to make us easier to actually test some of this stuff and prove it out. Like even I've had this branch open in the playground for forever that has some demo providers in it, like a split provider, a launch chocolate provider, all these client providers, and it's just been like sitting out there for forever in this one branch I've had, and I've had to keep rebasing on it. So I think that we're probably getting to the point where it's worth like publishing that, even though it is experimental, just so people can play with it. They can try it themselves. They can make a provider. I'm going to be very loud and clear that it's all experimental, but it doesn't stop people from at least experimenting with it. So that's my plan. I'll open a PR, and unless anybody objects, that's what I'm going to do. I think that's it for me. Anybody have any questions about, sorry, I kind of went fast through all those 3 topics, but does anybody have any questions about any of the stuff that I talked about or comments?
With the survey, are we still looking to get extra respondents? Is there like a like a timeline when we're kind of closing that for new?
What we announced was Wednesday, the 20, whatever last Wednesday was. Yeah, we announced the 22nd. Yeah, so it was Wednesday the 22nd, but I didn't actually close it until 2 days ago, Monday.
Okay.
But we didn't get any more response. We could keep it open. The only reason why I even wanted to close it was because it was wide open and there's a potential for spam. But now that I've like exported the results, hypothetically, we could keep it open and just like see if people add responses to it.
Yeah, okay.
I've exported the results to a Google Sheet, so at this point, we don't have to worry about that.
So what's the kind of the roadmap for getting to kind of like a first pass on the client side, kind of, sorry, I'm like struggling to wake up this morning. I'm not using my words very well.
Well, actually, I did add the other thing I created was this. Sorry, let me get up. Okay, this link here. So I did just recently create this. This roadmap. I put it in the chat. So this is kind of what I think is more or less the scope for what we need to do. So we have to close the remaining OFEPs. We had some back and forth on them today. We've closed the disposal one. I think we need to close the static and dynamic context and the events. I think events is very close to being closed. And I guess the one that feels more controversial and kind of ties into the global state question is the static versus dynamic context OFEP. But I mean, I think what I'm feeling is that going forward with kind of the experimental SDK, like I was mentioning, is not a bad step. And we could see how that feels. We could, update things in the playground. There's also a couple adopters right now of OpenFeature that use it for vendors and use our existing SDK for the client. So I would like to specifically reach out to those people and see, hey, here's our experimental client. Like, would you consider moving to this? Like, is there anything missing here? Does it solve some of your problems? So that's personally what I'd like to do once we get it published, is I'd like to specifically reach out to those people and point them to an artifact that they could actually use.
Yeah, I guess that's that OFEP, the static context, global static context OFEP, I think, sorry, not global, the static versus dynamic context thing. It feels like that's the main kind of like thing that we need to kind of commit to one way or the other, and then the rest of it will kind of just be following our noses mostly.
Yeah, I agree. We'll see, but I'm going to specifically reach out to those people once we actually have an artifact. That's another reason why I think it's worth doing, because it's one thing to ask somebody to take a look at a published artifact, and another one to ask them to like look at some branch that
Yeah.
that they have to like custom build. So I think that'll be helpful.
Cool.
And it looks like Justin had a topic, but he's still not here. So I guess we can call it short and sweet, unless anybody has anything else they want to bring up.
I could just do a quick update from a conversation we had in a previous community meeting. We had a kind of a conversation about making documentation clearer around like for people onboarding and kind of distinguishing between OpenFeature like as an SDK versus flag-D, and kind of like getting started. And like for those that weren't there in that conversation, there's this kind of there's been this thing that I think a few people have noticed, where new people who are kind of coming to the project think that they need to be like running a Kubernetes cluster to kind of just get started with OpenFeature, and kind of like this kind of getting conflated, like the OpenFeature as an SDK that supports a bunch of providers versus flag-D, which is like a provider. And one of the things that me and Mike would have kind of taken on, well, Mike's taken on and I'm helping him with, is redoing some of the getting started documentation to not start with flag-D. So Mike has an MVAR based provider. I actually have an even more like minimal provider that's just like it's static in memory. You just give it like a set of flags and their values, and it just is just there basically for kind of demo purposes, or for like also for unit testing it's useful. But yeah, the idea is basically to change that tutorial, those kind of getting started, so that rather than it going straight into flag-D, kind of start like super duper simply with something that's not like a production ready thing, but like lets you get to the point that you're using OpenFeature to do feature flagging. And then, it's like, great, that's kind of step one. Now let's like upgrade to using like a kind of like a real provider. And then it's like, okay, one of the providers you could use is, we support all these different vendors and open source, external providers. One of the providers we support is flag-D, and we'll be using flag-D for kind of like this example. So kind of trying to make it clearer to people that the two are not kind of the same. So that's the plan.
I think that makes sense. I think that'll be clear. I mean, I think that things like targeting rules and stuff like that are kind of important, but I think that for just the simplicity of people understanding what the project is, like a very simple environment variable provider makes sense. And then we can, like, as long as we kind of point to the more advanced use cases, I think that makes it pretty easy. Yeah.
And I think it is kind of like how a lot of people, it's definitely how I would encourage people to adopt feature flagging anyway, is like start with just something super simple, like some release toggles that are just controlled inside of the application. And then once you've got started, then you can get all fancy and kind of use like a full-on kind of flagging framework, but like a flagging service. But to get started, I normally tell people to do that anyway, because it's like easier to do it incrementally. So
yeah, totally agree. And I mean, a lot of people who are going to be doing the most basic things, may already literally be using environment variables to control this sort of stuff. So just like, being able to pop in an SDK that fronts it makes sense.
Yep. I think there might be potentially in the future, we might have like some different kind of getting started kind of tutorial type things, depending on like where you're coming from. So like if you're brand new to feature flags, there'll be like one path. If you are already using like Launch Darkly or Flagsmith or whatever, then there'd be like another path. It's more like a kind of like a migration path. And then if you're like more coming into it from like a you've been using some feature flagging stuff, but you want to kind of use you want to get started with flagged, then there'd be like another tutorial maybe that's around that, but kind of like having stuff that's more targeted at the persona of the person that's getting started. So yeah, maybe we'll get fancy once we've got that first use case covered. Oh, me wittering on has stalled enough maybe for Justin.
Hey, hey Justin, we were just I'm hoping you can hear me and your audio is connected, but we were just about to call it. I very quickly went over a few of my topics, including like the survey, but I saw that you had something else you want to talk about. So if you're ready, you're up.
All right, right on time. Yeah, so I wanted to talk about the data format. I'm trying to gauge interest in defining a data format for Boolean logic, if one doesn't already exist, and then using that as a mechanism to build a client-side evaluator. So we can do client-side flag evaluation. I'm just curious if there's interest in that. Does that sound like an OpenFeature thing or some plugin that someone should write on their own and not have an OpenFeature name on it? And I'm particularly interested if there's a vendor-y type person on the call to get their take.
I don't think there is today. We have a pretty low turnout today, but I think it might be worth like posting something about it in the Slack channel. I've been interested in this topic specifically because one of the things, I'll tip my hand a little bit, but one of the things I'm kind of interested in potentially defining with OpenFeature down the road is a generic flag definition language. So like, if you imagine being able to define flags as like a Kubernetes, a standard Kubernetes resource or a Terraform resource, and then having providers that would exist for vendors. So you could essentially make your flag definitions portable between vendors. So one of the things that would be required is like a standard targeting rule definition. I mean, you could use that like you're proposing on the client or as like a way to describe targeting rules across vendors to be used in like infrastructure as code.
I think it's also super interesting for like the idea of having like rules that are portable from client to server too. Like even if you're this kind of the same vendor, but being able to run them in like a Java backend and a TypeScript front end or whatever.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. So there's interest internal to eBay around like very low latency flag evaluation, and I think client-side evaluation is kind of the only option we reasonably have for that.
You should talk to Pato, the split CTO. Me and Todd just had a conversation with him, and he was like that's like one of the things that they're that's one of the things that they are passionate about at Split, because that's like one of their kind of differentiators. He might I mean, he might not be interested in chatting to you about it, but he may well be. And they've definitely got like 10 years or something of experience of like trying to make that work well. So
yeah, that is how they do their client side stuff. The other but they're unique in that they actually push the targeting rules to the client. Yeah. in terms of so what I can say from an implementation perspective, flag D, like the flag D plan, at least that we have, for a reference implementation is to do client side remotely, but obviously there's like a rules engine definition that you can see all about in flag D, and you could easily enhance it or like port it to the client if you wanted to. It uses something called JSON logic, which is like basically a JSON based rule definition. So I mean, if eBay is really interested, you could also maybe lend your view there and see if you think some kind of alternate deployment pattern would make sense, or you know, whatever. The other thing to consider that I've heard thrown around here a couple times in a similar vein is WASM. Like if you have a WASM module, you could hypothetically run that anywhere, and then it will solve your client problems just one time, you know. Totally theoretical, but
am I imagining it, or did Alex at some point look at using Q for flag D? CUE.
There's been discussion about that for sure.
Because that would be, aside the WASM thing, that would be like my mostly uninformed kind of place where I would start looking is Q as like because that's like right in its wheelhouse, right? Of kind of like adding some logic to kind of configuration-y kind of stuff. So.
Yeah, the reason that because I looked into Q a little bit too when we were looking at some of the flag D stuff. The problem that I've had with Q is that there's not that many implementations of it. I think there's a Go implementation and I think like one or two more, but this is also a few months ago, it could be out of date. The reason that I think we ended up doing JSON logic was because it's easily serialized to JSON, but the other one was that there was like 8 different implementations down to like Ruby. And a little bit more obscure languages. Q support is, I guess, going to grow rapidly, but there wasn't that much when I looked at it.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. Awesome. I think that was the only thing I had.
Cool stuff. Yeah, I would post about it in the channel, but I'm interested if you reach any conclusions there, and definitely keep in touch in terms of like the eBay client side stuff, because I'm really interested to see how that goes, however much you can share.
Yeah. I'll let you know what we learn.
Okay. Thanks everyone.
Yeah, what we didn't get a volunteer for Scribe for next time.
Oh yeah, I suppose we should do that. I mean, there's not very
Everyone's
many
like,
of us here.
I gotta go. Sorry.
I'll volunteer myself in lieu of somebody else.
Okay, volunteered.
Okay.
I volunteered.
See you guys.